Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me and for giving me this great opportunity to flash my aerial photos of Stockholm. Go back a few years, but I'm sure you won't notice anyway. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit this afternoon about a particular way of thinking about cities and urban spaces, and probably going to speak some languages that is slightly unfamiliar, which is going to be derived from some of my research during the last couple of, well, 5 to 8 years, trying to figure out how to think about cities in general, but in particular with relation to how we should understand mobility. I'll return to the notion of mobility in a second. Now, this is roughly what I'm going to go through. I'm going to say a few words for introduction, and then I'm going to speak a little bit about what in the social sciences are quite familiar terminologies nowadays, the mobilities turn, ways of thinking about mobility, and the physical, material, but also the cultural and social aspects of the various ways we are engaging with the world in a mobile sense. Then I'm going to zoom in a little bit to something that is slightly more introvert in a sense, which is my particular way of framing these sorts of things, and some of the concepts and notions that are coming out of works that I've been doing lately. And then finally, hopefully, I'll be able to say a little bit about Stockholm on the move or whatever. So I'm not going to talk process, I'm not going to talk plans. I'm going to speak a bit of theory. I'm going to speak, about stuff on the ground, which is, I mean, I've done quite a few things related to regional plans and the European Union and those sorts of things. But over the last decade or so, I've actually been working more on the everyday life and mobilities in the city and how those sorts of things are connected. And of course, I want to claim that these items and themes are hugely relevant for even regional planning discussions as well. Okay, so let me just, by way of introduction, say a few words about myself and then a little bit about this strange language that I'm going to use. So I'm sort of a hybrid, or I'm a sociologist that hangs out with architects and geographers, which I guess is the most precise definition of myself these days. I've been studying in the social sciences, political science, sociology, and I have a PhD in planning. I consider myself a renegade sociologist with an interest in space. I'm a professor of urban theory, and I'm a founder and a board member of a Center for Mobilities and Urban Studies at Alborg University. I think that institution is quite emblematic to the way we like to think about these sorts of things because it covers the humanities, the social sciences, and the technical faculties in an attempt to figure out how to think about cities in general and mobilities in particular. Also, I very recently founded a research cluster that we call MOT, Mobility and Tracking Technologies, where we work a lot with GPS apps and GPS transmitters and various sorts of RFIDs, Bluetooth, those sorts of technologies, and trying to figure out how they fit into planners' toolboxes nowadays, which I think they do, and they deserve attention for that sort of thing. Yeah, cross mobilities networks and other things. And actually also one thing I just want to mention is that I've been a long-term coordinator of the urban design studio working on the redesign of the metro in Copenhagen with urban designers. So this is really much where my interest is actually being fed to these sorts of things. So that's a little bit about the weird person standing in front of you. Now, in introductory terms, I want to talk a little bit about the notion of staging mobilities, which will illustrate how mobility in the network city may be understood from the point of view of the situation or situational mobilities. By looking at how infrastructures and the built environment create the frames for mobile everyday life situations, the talk aims to bridge the local and the regional scales in a perhaps rather unconventional way. So regardless if we're looking at regional motorways, urban metro systems, bike path system in the city, the key is to understand that we're dealing with mobile situations nested within a larger socio-technical mobility assemblages, transgressing fixed scales from the local to the global, the regional, and so forth. As for instance, the question of, is this house a local space? Well, I don't know how about you guys, but I'm tapped into the Wi-Fi for sure, right? So it doesn't really make sense to think of scales as Chinese dolls nested nicely into one another. And I think that kind of thinking comes a little bit out of the mobilities perspective as well. So the staging mobilities perspective proposes to set the mobile situation in the foreground and explore how mobility is reconnecting scales, technologies, and people. But this happens in a, and this is a really simplistic notion, but it works as a shorthand for opening up the analysis, I would argue. This happens in the process of staging from above by regulations, planning, systems, and design, and equally as a staging from below by mobile subjects in everyday situations. So this talk will build a new perspective on regional and urban infrastructure by showing that what takes place within these is much more than instrumental movements from A to B, and that this is understood best from the point of view of the mobile situation. So let me turn a little bit towards the theoretical framing of the mobilities turn and a particular way of talking about cities and mobilities that has been around in the social sciences for the last decade or so. Basically, the mobilities turn claims that mobility is more than A to B. So we're kind of interested in the non-instrumental features next to transport, right? So transport is important. It's important to move people and goods and stuff and bits and information and those sorts of things from one place to another. But as that progresses, we argue that you actually also are constructing identities, relation of self and other, your relationship to places, and those sorts of things, which hardly fits the vocabulary of the ordinary transport planner's sort of way of speaking about things. So mobility is an attempt to move beyond transport, and it questions this instrumental-only understanding of movement, i.e. movement equals costs, right? I'm sure all of you are familiar with the loads of statistics where you can see how much time we waste by commuting. I mean, equaling commuting with waste is kind of like a blind alley if you want to understand what commuting does to a society and to interactions. This is not something out of the blue, of course, and a lot of you are familiar with old studies done by that. Think about Rainer Banham's studies of the LA freeway made in the early 70s and some of other types. But I think it's a fairly still unconventional way of talking and planning communities and talking to planners where things are pretty much compartmentalized into traffic and experience and culture and the mayor's office with the businesses and all of that. So actually that doesn't really make a lot of sense. So the mobility turns try to open the black box of transportation. So it's a kind of a cross-disciplinary gaze, and this is just like a quick shot of some of these influential texts that you might want to, and you can, for those of you familiar with and know your history, you can go back and see Cameron Lynch's influential book there, where he actually talks a lot about a city's transportation system being a prime educational piece of equipment. So it's actually places where you are formatted as a citizen, and where you get, you know, your relationship to other people as well. Many people have sort of thrown in bits and pieces. A room the view is predominantly made by architects. In Search of New Public Domain is a collaborative effort by Martin Heyer, who's a political scientist, and Anna Reindrup, who's an architect. But otherwise, it is fair to say, I think that the book by Creswell, On the Move, and the book by John Early, Mobilities, are more firmly rooted within the social sciences and in sociology and geography in particular. Okay, so assumption is that cities are relational and they're networked. So the contemporary city is seen as a node in a network spanning from the local to the global. Therefore, it's important to leave the concept of the bounded and monocentric city and instead conceptualize how the urban is a set of functional, technical, cultural, and aesthetic transformations happening with a network of transit. By understanding the relational dimension of the contemporary city, the importance of designing for flows of goods, vehicles, and peoples, and science and ideas is for sure highlighted. This also means that everyday life is taking on a particular flavor in the network city. Everyday life is nested into these systems of circulation and synchronization. Within such complex socio-technical systems, humans and artifacts, embodied interaction and software mingle in complex and often routine-oriented ways. The mobile everyday life is staged from above by design and systems, and from below by humans in motion. Now, some of you have listened to talks today about ways of thinking about monocentrics and polycentrics, and these are some of the ideas that are bouncing around in the landscape. I'm sorry for it doesn't seem very clear, but some of you might recognize Cedric Price as being quite visionary in seeing that the contemporary city is like the scrambled egg situation. So we're kind of moving from a monocentric to a multiplex complexity of cities. And what does that mean in terms of our way of thinking about it? That's part of the discussion, of course. I think a particularly important concept and notion is the sense of place. And cities, sites, cities, and regions are always only something due to their relational couplings to other places, right? So it's a relational way of understanding this building, this region, this quarter, this neighborhood, and so forth. And mobility is actually the key to the nature of that relation. And of course, you can ask yourself, a problematic issue, is the place switched off? Could there be better connections? What's the quality of the connections? What's the nature? What's the segregational effects and those sorts of questions? But you could also ask the more looking for potentials, arguing, could new couplings be made, and how could we think of these sorts of things? So, in a network city, cities and regions and places are related within networks, and the crossing nodes are what I elsewhere refer to as critical points of contact. So, you could be looking at a city from the point of view of your assignment in this course and saying, okay, how is this network optimal in connection? How can we actually afford new connections? How can we think about new networks, new services, new ways of facilitating connection in a network like that? And actually, of course, also whether we can create new types of designs for those sorts of things. I want to say just a little bit extra on this with the media and the technology, because that's something I'm increasingly being occupied with. I think you can argue that a network city has acquired a new skin, a digital layer of communication. So you find mobile technologies to mobile people, but also that physical design, physical and digital infrastructures merge into hybrid mediated landscapes, where it doesn't make sense to start looking at the virtual and the real as separate entities. People are connected in networks, but they also carry networks as they go along. As well as mobile media means new social dynamics, they also mean new types of power, right? New types and actually, bottom line, I think the Mobilities perspective is very much interested in the fact that the way you organize a city and a region is very much a question of power and vested interest and contestedness and those sorts of things. So any region and city will be facing what we call competing mobility rationales, ways of performing in a particular sense of advocating for certain mobilities and others. So I guess main point is, and this is a real old school thing, right, that mobility matters. This is an old graph showing that, when you have heavy traffic, fewer friends across the street, which is sort of the standard way of thinking about it. And I think that's equally important, but it's also important to lift it into another discussion, which is what I call the staging mobilities perspective. The staging mobilities perspective is a shorthand for a way of thinking about the relationship between mobilities and cities that has been developed over a few years. And this is a sort of a graphic representation of what I'm interested in, and this is going to be published as a book at Routledge in January. But basically my claim is that what's interesting here is the situation, the practices going on here and now, right? And you can look at them from a very, very wide range of perspectives. But I would sort of zoom in and say that you at least have to think about the physical and material environments, and I include all the hardware and technologies into that. That's the upper chunk, right? But also that it's a question of social interaction, how we move about in the city with our fellow urbanites, either in a sort of accordance way or in a more conflictual sense. And most importantly, perhaps, is that it's a question of embodied performances, right? Bodies are moving in the city, making sense of it, making familiarity with technologies, sites, and ways of sort of negotiating systems. Now that's looking at the situation, right? And I will claim that you can sort of look at it as being staged from above by planning and regulation, and we've seen a lot of planning and sort of prints and stuff from above that tries to order and stage and figure out where should stuff go, where should people go, how should things flow, right? But equally, people are making lots of decisions on the ground every day, in terms of mode of transport, route choice, but also how do I carry myself? I mean, this is very much influenced by a Canadian sociologist, Irving Goffman, who argued that we present ourselves continuously in the everyday life. And what I've done is basically sort of put Goffman on the move and try to see what happens if you look at mobilities with the Goffman glasses. And what we see is that people present themselves. I mean, you could be aggressive driving, you could be a self-confident environmentalist showing it off with your latest gear. And the whole way of thinking about mobilities as something that is much more related to identity issues, cultural features, and interaction perspectives. I think that's what we have to go if we want to understand what is the creation. So even though you guys are probably going to be big stages and lay out how things are going to roll around in the city, please pay attention to the situation and the fact that subjects in the situation also, have certain reasons for performing as they do. So basically, mobilities do not just happen or simply take place. Mobilities are carefully and meticulously designed and planned from above, as one might say. However, they are equally importantly acted out, performed, and lived from below. So mobilities are staged, and people are performing mobilities, and they are engaged in social interactions of staging mobilities. I should say, as a parenthesis, that I've done a lot of case studies in metros and sky trains and public spaces to see the nitty-gritty tiny interactions between people who want to look big and people who are trying to making their way with the push carts and stuff like that. And I think it's banal, but it's also very clearly evident that when you look at the design and the planning going on, that a lot of that is not on the radar of people actually doing the plans and the design and the architecture. So I think this theatrical metaphor that is coined by Goffman is actually quite useful to figure out what is the quality of the everyday life, which I think, hopefully, you will agree with me, is the ultimate goal of any of our efforts, right? So staging mobilities is a process of creating lived mobility practices and the material preconditions to these. In the research that I've been doing, contemporary urbanism is understood as highly influenced by the state mobilities of planning, design, and architecture, governance systems, technological networks, as well as by the social interaction, cultural meanings, and the production of social order. Staging mobilities is a social, spatial, temporal process. That's not a nice word, but it's trying to include a lot of things, right? Of designing mobile lifescapes from above and performing mobile engagement from below. So what would that mean? Well, it actually would mean, like, if you're looking at staging from above, you'll be looking at planning, you'll be looking at government documents, procedures, plans, strategies, visions, and all of that. Equally, you'll be looking at designs from the point of view of design manuals, design codes, architecture on itself, regulations, laws, frameworks, legal frameworks that has an influential decision on how people can either move or not move. Because it's a relational concept, so every mobility is related to an immobility, right? It doesn't make sense to think about mobility as something on its own in that sense. But of course, it also relates to institutions, and you talked a lot about institutions today. Policy arenas, economic interest in actors, how to get money for this, how can you afford it, and so forth. From the other point of view, the staging from below has to do with consociates in interaction. The meeting and passing by on the everyday street, the way we carry our body, the way we perform in an interactional space as we perform traffic, right? The individual performances with focus on the body and its movement, but also the mobile self-presentation, where we are looking at social dynamics of interaction on the move, the way we are presenting ourselves and negotiating these sorts of spaces. So, I'm talking a lot about the physical settings and the material spaces and design, and of course there are mobile situations of what you might call clean simplicity, still, like one person walking on a forest path, or two people only, negotiating and passing on the pavement. However, in all sorts of ways, the situation reaches out. In material terms, this may be in the dependencies on hardware and physical connecting infrastructures, or as in the case of network technologies like our mobile phones, and how they may enact the situation in all sorts of ways, from figuring out where the best microbrewery is to when my train is leaving, right? So a mobile situation may be someone on the move in the most traditional sense, as well as it may include complex communications across time and space that influence the mobile situation. Furthermore, as people and goods and information and science move, understandings of self and other in the built environment changes, either in very dramatic ways or in completely, unnoticeable ways. The key insight is that we need to understand the contemporary city as a networked assembling of circulating people's goods and information and science that are created in relational networks, creating what we might call the meaning of movement. The lifescape of such mobile and network conditions create individual experiences, as well as collective processes of inclusion and exclusion. Sites, areas, people may be switched on or switched off, thereby being subject to complex relations of mobilities, capital, and capacity to move, i.e. motility. Now this might be illustrated by a key concept derived from urban government's vocabulary, which is this notion of frontstage and backstage. A lot of people have used that in analysis of public space versus private space, but government's point is actually that we all carry a front stage and a backstage, right? Right now I'm doing my best to perform lecturer with a kind of sense of that I know what I'm talking about. That's my front stage thing, right? So I'm not trying to backstage all my inadequacies right now. We can talk about them later, right? So everybody has this kind of presentation of self with a front stage and a backstage. But the interesting thing is that we've looked at people on the move and how they actually negotiate that demarcation line. It becomes increasingly complex because people are moving. So what is taking place accordingly is a mobile front staging, backstaging process within which mobile subjects undertake performative work in a process of negotiating stage demarcations of front and back, as well as they are staging their own mobile line of demarcation. For instance, when you appropriate or we appropriate space in the train compartment by means of mobile objects, newspapers, books, cell phones, etc., or whatever takes place within the car as a mobile domestic site, which is a backstage, but yet utterly public transparent, which is a front stage. By applying the front stage, backstage metaphor to the staging mobilities frame, we see that there's a process of mobile territorialization, illustrating the dynamic character of contemporary urbanity. The mobile situation is enacted by embodied practices where the reflexive and rationally calculated practices meet and mingle with the embodied tacit acts of mobile performativity. So you might calculate when you need to go to the bus, but the way you go to the bus or the way you interact in the bus might fall back into the cultural scripts that you think none of when you're actually performing them, right? So the social interaction dimension of the analytical frame carries not only social interaction, but equally important, an awareness to the body and the performances related to doing mobilities. So you could say that people on the ground are actually doing mobilities. They're performing the act of mobile practices, and as such, the theatrical metaphor make even more sort of sense in the way that you think about how they act themselves, but also how other people are creating the frames for action. So the material and geographic location for the mobile situation is understood as an expanded version of Goffman's notion of setting. Within that setting, there's a lot of focus on network technologies. I want to speak a little bit about that because I think that is increasingly important. I think technologies and networks of mobile communication, such as GPS, phones, laptops, etc., are defining an increasing part of the everyday life mobile situations in the contemporary society. And I think it's important to understand that the face-to-face interaction that Goffman was looking at when he was doing his studies in the 50s and 60s is actually being sort of challenged a little bit by these technologies. So we could talk about a non-proxemic mobile interaction, which means that we're actually interacting even though we're not face-to-face, right? So you're sitting next to a guy in the train compartment, texting to a friend somewhere else, right? Which means that you carry networks, and you're also actually in an interactional space where you have a complexity of the proxemic and the non-proxemic at the same time in the situation. So these kinds of technologies actually enact a particular mobile situation that is quite different from at the days of Goffman, of course. And moreover, I think they are, and this is maybe something a little more from my home country, I have a heated debate with some planners right now in getting them to pay attention to Wi-Fi and 3G and those sorts of things, because clearly that's not urban planning. Well, I think everybody knows that sewers and tarmac and bricks and mortar are parts of the city. So I think the time has come to realize that all those weird networks and invisible connections are equally part of the city, and they're actually interfering quite a lot in understanding or the practices that people are undertaking. There's a particular discussion amongst engineers and people sort of creating the technical side of these sorts of systems, which they sort of call humans in the loop. And increasingly, mobilities are being staged and afforded by non-human to non-human communication. Like, for instance, when a flight control system communicate to a flight, or when a driverless metro system like the one we have in Copenhagen is actually performing lots of everyday life mobilities. And such non-human mobility staging is, of course, on the edge of a framework looking for practices and people in what they do. However, as soon as the human agent becomes embedded and assembled into this network of M2M or machine-to-machine communication, the situation, of course, becomes much more relevant. And one of those systems is, of course, the ITS type of systems that we find in many cities around the world. You could argue that the network technologies embedded into the systems of the contemporary mobilities are stretched, and mobile situations are thereby not solely a case of physical co-presence. The intelligent traffic system, for instance, that inform about traffic jams, roadworks, or accidents ahead via messages to mobile phones, or the location-based services facilitating the choice of where to shop, eat, or drink, are just a few examples of the systems interfering into the situation. Moreover, a large number of trips are now done while people are online communicating or texting, pointing even more into the direction of including non-proxemic interactions and communications into the theoretical framing of a mobile situation. In consequence, this perspective also runs in parallel with claims that the virtual or digital realm cannot be separated from the real or the material. So this notion of cyberspace elsewhere and real space here is increasingly creating a lot of problems for us, and particularly if you look at location-based technologies where the network or the connection becomes really close. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the notion of mobile assemblages. So the system and the socio-technical networks that host or facilitate the contemporary mobilities are complex and large material environments where technologies, human softwares, codes, semiotics, and communicative systems, objects, and artifacts are assembled in a specific combination facilitating and affording certain practices, but also restricting other practices. Like, for instance, when you talk about access to a particular system, I was struck by the feature that there apparently are 2 lines or more in Stockholm where you can use a particular way of ticketing which does not connect to the other types of tickets, and that's kind of creating different layers. And we have a lot of examples of that. I did an in-depth case study of the SkyTrain in Bangkok, which is sort of on its own league, and it's completely disconnected from a lot of the other systems of mobility in that city, creating a lot of sort of challenges on a practical term, but also suggesting to us that the notion of assemblage and how things are put together in the situation is crucially something that has to include the technological dimension. So mobile assemblages specific to particular modes of transport mix and relate to the material design and manifestations of contemporary mobilities in ways that must be understood relationally, and in the cases of this presentation also in semiotic terms. I'm very interested in the notion of semiotics in the sense of science trying to afford or sort of hinder particular ways of moving in the city. And as any good architect would know, the less wayfinding and signage, the better, right? If a building is self-suggestive to what people should do, then that's really nice. But when you go to the Stockholm Central Station, it doesn't make sense. You can't find your way unless you have some clues and some visual semiotics. And of course, increasingly, some of that semiotic layer is being on your laptop or your cell phone or your iPad or whatever. So those systems tap into one another. Okay, so I'm gonna scoot toward the end, so don't worry. So the mobile situation may be acted out by a single individual, as for example, if I alone ride the driverless metro train of Copenhagen, or if I walk the woods not meeting anyone. The situation is an assemblage of a human agent, physical design and material infrastructure of the built environment in which we may find complex mobile situations with multiple social interaction taking place, as well as we may find them enacted by the sole individual. Staging mobilities thereby focuses on the situation as it is framed and created in 3 analytically distinct dimensions: in the physical settings and material spaces, in the media networks, and in social relations. The mobile situation is always an embodied performance, where one or more humans are present in a situation of mobility and immobility. Even though I, strictly speaking, is immobile whilst I'm, for example, waiting for the green traffic light. We were joking a little bit about the Danes' preference for waiting for green even in the middle of the night. So it's also a cultural feature, right? We're standing there like dopes waiting for the man to become green so we can walk, right? That's, of course, something us in the province do more than the people in the capital city. So even that would strictly qualify as an example of a mobile situation. So in the staging mobilities perspective, we have to understand the mobile situation as a dynamic and process-oriented event in time and space, and thus not as a fixed point. We're not looking at points in space, we're looking at processes in time and space, right? Okay, that's pretty abstract, right? So let's try to see if we can sort of dive down through the clouds towards some of the discussions that will materialize ahead of you in this curriculum and in this program. I think one of the things that I really want to talk about, and we're running out of time, but some of the things that I'm really interested in is what I call the critical mobilities thinking. I mean, critical is, to many people in the social sciences, is about showing power, you know, and being critical to society and all of that. To me, critical means doing stuff like that guy on the picture, right? Crawling around on these concepts, making most of them, figuring out what they can do for you, right? And I think mobilities can actually be crawled around on quite a bit. I've crawled around, I've been that guy quite a bit on that concept. seeing what I can figure out. And one of the things I think is important is, of course, to challenge the self-evident. All right, commuting equals waste. Nobody likes commuting. That's a big lie. If you interview people commuting, a lot of them love commuting for the specific space they create for themselves, if it's in a car even though a lot of people would say car commuting is bad for the economy, right? So I think we need to challenge those kinds of knee-jerk reactions and interpretations of what's actually going on. And of course, seek innovative solutions. I mean, I shouldn't say this in a forum like this. I mean, that's self-evident to you guys. And there's a small duality to this. I think all problems have a potential side. And equally, all potential have a dark side or problematic side, right? I think exercising your mind on those sorts of things is quite useful. And that has to do with one of my pet issues is that theory and practices are each other's preconditions and not oppositions. There's an old proverb saying there's nothing as practical as a good theory, which I think is quite helpful to think about. Theories are tools, right? The staging mobilities terminology might not suggest to you how you should fix your regional plan, but I think it suggests to you that you should go down on the eye level of people, figure out how does it feel, how does the body make sense of these systems, and how come nobody wants to go on that line at that time or whatever. Well, maybe it's because you should experience how that feels. Okay, so I'm zooming in. I think if we talk about Stockholm and a wider region, and this could, of course, I'm sorry to say that, relate to any city, of course, or region. I think a future policy and planning frame for Stockholm should start by acknowledging that how any regional city is a network of situated mobilities. Further on, the staging of mobility is vital both for the city's competitive edge, which is stuff people like to talk about, like accessibility, regional logistics. I mean, you saw the vision, right? It's not a small vision, so if you want to play on that ground, you have to offer connectivity. But also as for the well-being and quality of life for the individual regional dweller. Everyday life mobility in a network city is also challenging our fixed and static notion of scale. And I think this is one of the points where I always get into an argument with my architectural friends. You know, I think scale is something in our minds rather than something out there, which is highly provocative to people who spend a life defining themselves and the profession as confined to a fixed scale, right? Which I think is not mocking their practices, but actually just suggesting that maybe you should have a different go at that concept. So all in all, I hope that this is not anything that you can make a plan or draft from, but I hope it invites you to think a little bit differently about a dimension of infrastructures and urban development that has to do with mobilities in everyday life. Thank you.
Thanks, Ole. Okay, so we can take first questions now.
Yeah. Not gonna make it.
Yeah, go
Hello. I have a question. You talked about the production of social order, and I find it interesting how do you connect it to the perspective of from above and from below?
The question of social order and how it's related to staging from above and below, yes. Right? Well, I think well, it's a good question, as you say, right? But the point I want to make from using Goffman's concepts and his focus on interaction is that every interaction is actually an expression of a situation where there's a kind of a notion of a social order, right? I mean, that bloke who just skipped out, he was very quiet, right? Because he didn't want to, he could have made another exit, right? And you guys are sitting sort of, given the time of day and the lack of oxygen in this room, quite decently on your paying attention. So we're playing a game called a lecture, right? And that is part of the social order. Now, we didn't invent the lecture. We stepped into a situation in history and time and space where the lecture already was around, right? So this situation has actually been staged already. But also the way we engage with that situation, how we reproduce it over time, has of course to do with not something from above, but the way we interpret it and how we can make do with it. If we take this out to the street, because that's where we're going to go, you can think about the order of the street interaction, right? You got like design manuals deciding how much space the bus needs, and you got like red lights and green lights and stuff. You got, I mean, if you want to have a driver's permit, right? You gotta learn the rules, right? But everybody knows, even a kid knows that, you know, one thing is the rules, another thing is the practices out on the street, which means that the negotiation between the top-down design of, for instance, driving a car and the way you actually produces it is much more complicated. And the order perspective is actually what comes out of the way we negotiate, right? So there are certain things that, you know, for instance, like, I don't know Swedish traffic regulation, but in Denmark, if you come into the motorway, you have to give way, right? So you can sort of mingle nicely, right? That took a long time for Danes to figure out, because people figured, well, I got the biggest car, or I got the most speed, so why don't I just go first, right? And so that evolved over time, even though the thing was already there from top down. So the social order and the production of social order is something that takes place between those two kind of levels in a much more in a highly complicated way, and which is not something, I mean, you can, one of my favorites is semiotics, right? You can try to sign yourself to order, right? Like saying, don't do this and that. And that works unto a certain extent, right? The Northern Zealand traffic entity that I forgot the name of has actually tried in the Danish rail commuting trains to put a lot of signs up, because the commuters are so fed up with people who have no manners, right? You know, they talk in quiet zones on their cell phones and all of that. You would never do that, of course, because you can see whoosh, it's a quiet zone, right? So the order is being imposed on you, but people actually have to negotiate that social order themselves. And sometimes, you know, someone would stand up and say, shut up, right? And try to do stuff about it, which again shows that the social order is produced, right? And you can do things in design and architecture. I mean, like, you know, for the panopticism idea, you know, you can create spaces where people are behaving in a certain way, but only to a certain extent. So I don't know if that's maybe a highly abstract way of answering your question.
I was interested in how this production of social, if you think the characteristics of this is different in the mobile situation from other situations, is it more, is it?
No, I think
is it the same?
Of course they are different in the sense that what takes place when we are moving. I mean, why are traffic signs big on the motorway? Because our tiny brain can only catch so much information in a span of time, and we're moving 140 kilometers an hour, so we need big signs, right? So the speed and the fact that we move do change the dynamic of interaction between us, right? That's, you know, that's inevitable. But at the same time, there's a lot of standard cues, like, you know, you can tell if people look wealthy. You can see in your back mirror that it is a BMW and not a BMW and not a Skoda. You can, I mean, those are standard sort of stratifying mechanisms in the social, right? So I think you will find a mix. But I think some of the environments and what we do as we are on the move get things even more complicated.
Yeah. You again. It's okay.
I guess my front of stage now would dictate that I'm meant to ask an intelligent question, so I don't look like an idiot.
You got it.
Yeah, but I was wondering, so I kind of understand the principle of these well-established social constructs that everyone is behaving within, and there's a certain expectation about the behavior that you might not, and that comes to define society as it is today. Mm-hmm. And I was just wondering, as an urban planner, or the kind of the opposite for people to imagine would just essentially descend into chaos. I was wondering or chaos within the framework of the existing social constructs, if that makes sense. But I was wondering if you had imagined an alternative. I understand that this tool is used to challenge the existing notions of space, and I was wondering, as an urban planner, whether or not you'd investigated or identified certain alternatives or spatial manifestations that might promote or dictate a different definition or behavior.
I'm gonna use the privilege of answering the question as I understand it, right? And I think, yeah, I think you find that all the time. I mean, you see a lot of, there's a lot of appropriation of spaces where people actually perform not as the sign says, right? No skating here. And just you wait and see. There'll be lots of skating unless there are physical barriers, right? So I think you find lots of examples where people are, and this has nothing to do in particular with mobilities. You find it in every walks of life and every space, right? Where there's a particular, my favorite remembrance of the situation was an Italian conference where I was standing next to the conference organizer on the huge no smoking sign while he was smoking away, right? It doesn't really make sense to him, that sign. So I think you find lots of examples. I mean, from an empirical point of view, I was looking at the SkyTrain in Bangkok, and how that was quite interesting. The vendors were not supposed to be on this level of the sort of the tracks between. They were not supposed to be there. Actually, it was illegal, and it's full of vendors. And they appropriate the space, and actually the tourist loves it, right? So they have this tiny market type of things going on there, even though it's not legally. And of course, you can find all sorts of ways of challenging that. If you go into the more subversive, anti kind of things, I mean, I love the art project where an artist have mapped a route through Manhattan where you cannot be seen by CCTV. I think that's really cool. And those are kinds of ways of playing with you know, the organization, the top-down, the way, I mean, some of the stuff, the critical mass, you know, there's these bike people that are not blocking traffic, but are traffic. The way they sort of flow over the spaces occasionally, and almost like by accident, to challenge the order of the car, right, is something. So I think you find millions of examples of that. The question, of course, is how do planners engage with that? Because they are sort of like enforcing the sort of the monopoly of violence of the state, to speak with old school sort of Weberian notions. So yeah, you do find it.
Do you think it could be positive, or in some cases it could be negative? If you were to challenge, or where there's perhaps activities that are not in line with the established social order, which can perhaps be criminality or something like that, and perhaps, I mean, you seem to suggest that it is a positive thing or a useful tool to investigate new ways or alternative methods of thinking, but sometimes it might not always be a positive thing.
No, I agree. I mean, and the big issue, of course, is if you want to do planning and public policy, I think the closest you can get to some of that is, we had a conversation earlier today about temporary space, temporary uses of space. You know, the planners sometimes have to let go and don't have to blueprint everything out in 50 years' time, but just, you know, leave the damn thing alone for a while, right, and see what happens. That can be done without necessarily, I mean, you still have the police to bring in if people are doing bad stuff and stuff like that. So I think yeah, there is an option for thinking about subversive or experimental or countering practices that could, but it's pretty hard to put in a regional plan.